here we are. And yeah, so thank you for making the time. And it's really wonderful that you were able to do this. And my students are very excited as well that you're willing to take a few minutes to have a look at some of their questions. And yeah.
I'm very happy, Zhenya, to talk to your students. I'm far away from them geographically, being on the other side of the United States. And it's substantially colder here. It's -3 Celsius, which they can centigrade, which they can convert into Fahrenheit if they wish here. And but it's I feel their presence, and I wish them well.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you. And I know that they are many students wrote me that they perceive it as a really incredible opportunity to be able to ask a question to somebody who is, so incredibly, prolific in so many ways and so knowledgeable about so many interesting things. So I've put those questions, and I had obviously to make a short list. There were many, many more questions,
yes,
of course. But as one of my friends and mentors at Caltech, Alex Warshawski, liked to put it, brevity of life imparts constraints. So I've taken a total, I think it's a very good, very dry way of expressing this, which Woody Allen might have said, time is nature's way of making sure everything doesn't happen at once. So I have 7 questions because 7 is a lucky number.
Yes.
Taken them and put them into 3 categories because 3 is another wonderful number. And so we maybe can start with 1, which I called loosely technology and us. And let's just start with the first question. It's a question that comes from David, who says, not everyone across the planet has the luxury to indulge in our technological advances. Do you think that all of humanity should have, let's say, a computer or a device to connect to the internet? Also, could this be potentially problematic?
Well, I think everyone should have a computer today. It seems an inevitable evolution of humanity, this age of intelligence via computer. And it's impossible to avoid it. It's also clear 2 things, that the computers have given us infinite capabilities. That if I see an old movie with Ingrid Bergman, I can get it tonight and look at it on the computer. And on the other hand, it is also clear that they can be misused and cater to everything that's wrong in the human spirit, in terms of spreading rumors, in terms of bullying and things like that. Still, I think we cannot avoid computers. I am worried about artificial intelligence. You didn't ask about that. I mean, David didn't ask about that, but I think it's sort of implicit in that. I am very worried about the wave of artificial intelligence that's breaking on us in our profession and also in society as a whole. And I'm worried in part because it is taking away thinking, in the sense.
Serious problem, I agree with you.
And understanding in favor of getting the number right. And we can talk some more about that. But I think everyone should have a computer, definitely. There are problems which come out of too much reliance on computers, that's clear.
Yes, I couldn't agree more, or one other way of saying the same would be I couldn't disagree less. So, Richard Feynman once said something, what was it? He said, a computer is nothing more than a gigantic filing cabinet, no matter what you do about it. Do you think he would have still said it now, or do you think he would have had a different view?
Yeah, I think he would have said it still now, and he would have been just as suspicious as I am of some of the use of computers to get numbers. I would think so. There is something about the quantitative changing into qualitative, and so that, yes, it is just a filing cabinet, but the efficiency of that filing cabinet and its astounding ability to do things so much faster, so much better than we are, is sometimes a problem.
Yes. And you know, here's an interesting thing. I heard there's this German psychiatrist called Manfred Spitzer, and you may or may not have heard the name. I heard it from my brother. You have?
Yes, I have heard of him.
Yeah, okay, wow. Yeah, so he had this interesting term he called the digital dementia. And he gave beautiful lectures on, if you can have a lecture on such a somber topic and call that beautiful, I suppose. But he made an interesting point, which I always like to emphasize to my students, and that is, there is a difference, fundamental difference between information and knowledge. Out there on the internet is information. In our heads, hopefully, we have knowledge. You can see my cat loves you. He always comes when we talk. He always immediately comes. Yeah.
Here that you have two cats, don't you?
Yes, I do have two cats. The other one is under the table.
Keep your feet warm?
Yes, it's wonderful. Yeah, I don't know, now I look back, I can't even imagine once upon they had this sinister existence with no cats. I don't know how I could ever go back to it.
Well, I don't know. You better talk to a dog person. That's not me. But it's hard to imagine an existence without computers today. But there are clear dangers, and there are very interesting things to talk about. For instance, how has chess playing, and there is recently, just as we're talking, there is a popular Netflix series about chess.
Yeah.
And how has chess playing changed after the computer beat Kasparov?
Yes.
And it hasn't gone away. And it's interesting to talk about how it's changed. So what I'm getting at, even as we see the dangers of computing and artificial intelligence, we haven't talked about the dangers, but I can tell you about some.
I think we might, because it's one of the questions.
Okay. Even when we realize we're not going to change things, I don't think we can go back. There is also something interesting to talk about. Can one go back on technological practice? So there was one experiment done in the world, and that is the Japanese, at some point after the Dutch came there, and the Dutch introduced guns, muskets. The Japanese, of course, learned how to use them and how to reproduce the guns, because they had their own very good metalwork. And the guns ruined the samurais' games in a way. And so they outlawed guns. And they stayed outlawed for a period of about 150 years. But then they failed. They came back. There was no way to prevent those weapons from being used. And there is no culture that I know that, for instance, has managed to control weaponry in the way of rolling back technology and forbidding the use of weapons of a certain kind. We're trying that with chemical weapons right now, but you can see the troubles we're having.
It is very hard. You know, I have this book, which I haven't read because it's too complicated, but I scratched a little bit on the surface. The book is called A Study of War. And in that book, they call about the Darwinistic evolution of the war machine and how, you know, you have pockets of different war machines that
Yes.
come in contact and start competing. And one of the unfortunate effects that it has is that first thing that it does is it takes the most peaceful people and eliminates those because they're the weakest in that competition, and then it gradually ramps the pressure up and up and up until only the most warlike people are left. But then the machine becomes the dominant feature because then at some point you get into a stalemate situation. And
Well,
then the
we're going to keep that from happening.
Say it again?
We're going to keep that from happening.
Yes, well, I can very much hope so. It's a very, very scary thought.
Let's go on to the next question.
Let's get to the next question. So there was a student called Janet, and she asked a question that's actually sort of related to the last question, and that is, what kinds of disadvantages might our next generation have due to the advancements of technology?
So one thing that's already obvious is the loss of ability to read maps from the result of the incredible advantage that global positioning system gives us in finding our way from place to place. But that's a minor thing. I'm a little more worried about more deeper things. That is, with artificial intelligence, and I have in mind the words like machine learning and neural networks for solving complex problems. Some of those problems, like getting the energy of a molecule, let me be very specific. We have to calculate the energy of a molecule very often, and then we vary to geometry and we calculate it again. You have done that yourself in your research.
Yeah.
So what we do is we solve Schrödinger's equation, a quantum mechanical equation that governs the motion of charged particles. We solve it approximately. We can't solve it exactly. And we get an energy, and then we recalculated it for another geometry, and we find that water is bent and not linear, and much more complicated things than that. Today, that calculation can be done. It's now done by a quantum computer. So that's another story, quantum computing, still another side of this. But it basically, under artificial intelligence, those numbers can be obtained exactly, much better than any quantum mechanical calculation. Moreover, you can get the computer to guess from the structure of a molecule what its energy is, and it can learn to guess that better than anyone who does the solution of the equation. And so when you compete with such a system, you always lose, but you understand nothing about what made the energy of the molecule. So what you will ask me is, what do you mean by understand? So I think the students in your class will understand what understand means, because to understand something is to be able to teach it and learn it. And until that day, when the world of Matrix, the movie, comes, and you and I and our students all have a plug in the back of our head.
Another thing, may we never experience that.
May we never experience. But until that day, that computer doing that calculation exactly, but not being able to tell us how and why it did it, it is understanding nothing. It just does a pattern recognition extremely well, much better than we can. And so the danger is that people will lose the ability to understand, not to calculate. The calculation is boring ultimately. It's something for nerds. It's not what I want to do. I want to be able to understand in the way of teaching that these factors enter electrostatics, that geometries of molecules matter, that atoms bumping into each other matter. That's understanding at the qualitative level, exactly where your students are getting it.
Yes, and I can absolutely see that, there was this, I think it takes me back to an old book by Ilf and Petrov, two Russian satirical writers who wrote this beautiful novel, The 12 Chairs, where they made fun of the Soviet Union and ways just beautiful. And one thing that they described there is this story of somebody who's memorized the entire encyclopedia on all the rivers of the world. So he can recite by heart, and for a day he can go on. Nile is the longest river in Africa. Nile is so and so wide. Nile is so and so long, and so this and that. So once you get him going, he will give you this whole thing. But if you go up to him and ask him what is the longest river in Africa, he will look at you saying, I don't know. And so it's a little like this. So you have that thing, but it doesn't really, information by itself and memorization in particular, I think, is another problem, that people memorize instead of remember. And so they have all the bits in their head, but not the picture somehow. So it's not integrated. And I think, that's a very, very interesting, important point. Another question, and then there were many questions that fit this pattern. I mean, you can tell we're going through a time right now that is not very pleasant. So people have thoughts that are, often worried thoughts. What is our future going to be?
Yes.
And so, I mean, the question that I ask myself is, future is, every time I try to predict my future, I've always been wrong. That if there's one thing I've learned. But what about the present moment? What do we learn from what's going on right now? What do we take from this into the future? That's not on the list, that's a question.
No, how can we answer that question without getting into politics? And I don't think we want to get there.
No, we certainly don't want to get into politics.
Yes. We can't answer we can't know the future, but I think one should begin with some faith that whatever happens, you as an individual, I, the student, whoever, that they can probably, they will have to live in the future and they can face it. And perhaps we can provide strategies for facing the future. You have to remember that I'm a survivor of World War II as a child. I was born in Southeast Poland in 1937, which was not a good place and time for a Jewish child to be born.
Yes,
and most of my family was killed, but my mother and I survived. And I still remain an optimist about the human existence.
And that's just amazing.
I think the act of survival is enough. And I'm not sure, mind you, I didn't necessarily become, nor did those of my relatives who survived, necessarily become better people because we survived. That's another romantic fallacy, that if you've suffered, you're better. You're not, but you've survived. And that by itself is enough, because it is testimony that you can survive, that there are children who went through unmentionable things in that war, nevertheless came out as normal people. And I don't want to know about the children who became alcoholics or something else went wrong because they were abused. I understand them and their pain, and I know what they went through. What amazes me is how normal human beings can come out of those situations. And I feel that I emerged as such. And that's what gives me optimism about human nature, that we can overcome that and other things along the way.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, on a much smaller scale, of course, because I mean, but I did have the strange privilege and whatever you might call that to watch the Soviet Union collapse from the front rows. And we were living in Moscow back then. And really,
it was scary, I bet.
Walking distance from the Kremlin, so nothing like the Holocaust by no means, but scary enough to be very scary to a child. I was not scared, but most of my friends were. But you know, then I remember, you know, moving. I got so scared, I became a chemist. You know, I was a musician before that. Yeah, so sometimes it can make a difference, I guess. But let's come to the next question then, maybe from Samantha. How can we combat the appeal of conspiracy theories and fight reverse enlightenment?
Well, I don't know what reverse enlightenment is, but I know what conspiracy theories are. So the first thing is we have to examine what it is that's attractive about conspiracy theories. And I think what's attractive is that they are quasi-religious narratives. They tell you that they testify, or they start out by saying there is some order in the world, except that we're not in charge of that order. Somebody else is. There is a conspiracy to keep us from knowing. The second part that plays into that, so it's a quasi-religious feeling that there's somebody in charge. The second part is there is a damn good story in these. The story has the feelings of a thriller novel. That's something to learn from. Whereas real life is boring and no one's in charge. It's chaotic and there is no good story to it. So we are naturally attracted to good stories with the feeling that someone's in charge. So how can we counter that? Some people would say is you tell people the truth, but that the truth is often not romantic and not so interesting. I think what I would suggest is something else, is tell them other stories, invent for them other thrillers, make them read thrillers. John le Carré just passed away yesterday, a great writer of spy novels. Joseph Cannon is another one. I would ask people to read those and to get interesting stories, also to read narratives where someone's in charge, but not the one we think is in charge, meaning our sort of God. Read about other creation myths, about other ways. This is an untypical piece of advice. Read other creation stories, other religious narratives, in order to be thrilled by them. And if you see those other ones, you will see your initial QAnon story as just another story like those.
That's a very, very wise piece of advice, I think, actually. And so, yeah, something changed with the lighting for a second.
Yeah, I have an automatic switch in that.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, no, that is very, very interesting.
That was fun. It is true. Some of those stories are quite remarkable that we hear around us.
Oh, yes, no, you wonder it's sort of like, you know, my friends and I, we've been always wondering is, there's so many jokes in the world, and we just keep telling them and passing them around. But who comes up with them? Where do all those jokes come from? It's another thing one could wonder similarly, right? Take a good joke, and who came up with it? Where did it come from? Nobody knows, but people retell it.
There usually is an inventor, but if it's good, it's retold. Other people steal it.
Yes, but what happens actually that makes it more similar to those theories, and one might think, is that once a joke gets launched, if you will, so somebody came up with it, but then it enters the world of Darwinian pressure, because then you come up with different variants of the jokes, but they're competing with each other. And you know, the best variant eventually makes it to the top. So there are some interesting parallels there too, perhaps. Now, yes?